Hello, my name's Stephen Wright. I'm Professor of Economics at Birkbeck. I'm also head of department, but more importantly, from your perspective, I'm one of the team of lecturers who will be teaching you if you come to one of our Economics Plus programs in the autumn at Birkbeck. Now, when I say come to Birkbeck, of course, in this current environment, we don't actually expect at the moment that it's going to be possible for you to come to Birkbeck, at least at the beginning of term. We hope it is, but we think it's unlikely. So we're making plans to do all our teaching online right from the beginning of term. If necessary, we'll carry on throughout the academic year. And even if we don't, which we sincerely hope, we hope we'll be able to return to face-to-face teaching. But if you're not able to come to Birkbeck at the beginning of the year and you get stuck outside London, we will continue to make online lectures and all the teaching will be available online throughout the academic year. So this is just a brief taster session to give you a feel of what to expect in terms of the content of the programme, which will be the same whether we're teaching online or face-to-face. And these are the programs that we put within this Economics Plus designation. So if you're thinking of studying economics, an obvious question is, why are you wanting to study economics? What matters from your perspective? What's the big issues to think about? Now, we actually have a bit of a feel already, a pretty good feel of what students these days seem to be thinking is the most important issue. We have this from talking to our own students. But we also have it from the online resource that we use for teaching. We make use, instead of a conventional textbook, we're using an e-book produced by the coreecon.org group, which is a new resource. It's only been around for a few years. We pioneered teaching this actually when it first came out. Now it's being used around the world by literally hundreds of universities around the world. And you read it online, you don't have to pay anything for it, and you simply click read and then you have access to all the material in it, which includes both text and interactive diagrams, but also videos. It's a very, very useful resource, and I'd encourage you to have a look at it even before you turn up. But one of the things that core people do at the beginning of every academic year throughout the world is they ask students, what is the most important issue from your perspective that economists should be looking at? And the result of that survey gives us a word cloud, where each word in the cloud, the size of the word, reflects how important it was to the students in the survey. And what you can see that as of 2019 at least, the big word that comes up is inequality. The primary concern of students throughout the world, wherever you do the survey, you get that response. The other big word clearly is unemployment, very much bound up with inequality. Old words that used to be really important, like inflation, these days don't seem to be such a primary concern for students. Another thing to notice is that we do see a growing emphasis on environmental issues. So we're seeing environment here, sustainability, sustainable development, all topics which we'll be looking at during the course of the lectures. But of course, things have moved on since, as we all know, since this chart was developed. And so clearly, one thing we would expect when they do this survey next year is this is going to turn up. How big? Who knows? It could be this big. It could dominate people's thinking. And of course, one thing we want to try and emphasize about the way that we teach at Birkbeck is that while we're teaching key ideas in economics, we don't want to ignore what's going on around us. Here's an example of how right back in March, we started looking at the issue of COVID in Introduction to Economics lectures, with some basic maths, but also looking at some of the key economics. And remember, this was right back at the beginning when the British government was still making its mind up how to deal with COVID. People were talking about when the peak in the curve would happen, relying on essentially how many, a significantly large fraction of the population catching the disease. And so we were drawing these diagrams and talking about what would happen if the British government took no action. We then went on to continue talking about as lectures proceeded, as we switched online as we had to, as the lockdown happened. Now, I haven't got time to talk about COVID in any great detail, but if you're interested in pursuing the topic, the lecture notes that I produced for Birkbeck students, I then turned into a short video, which is available on the Corecon website with a range of other resources on COVID. So if you're interested in COVID, I'd encourage you to take a look at that and get a feel of the way that you can think about it as an economist. But let's get back to the word cloud, because the other issues that students were thinking about right at the beginning of 2019, those issues haven't gone away, and in particular, inequality. Now, when you come in to study economics, we're going to say to you, yes, well, you're right to think about inequality, but one key element that we start introducing straight away is how should an economist think about inequality? And here's a diagram that we'll look at in a lot more detail in lectures, but gives you a bit of a feel for the nature of the data that we see on inequality in the world today. Because it brings out two dimensions of inequality in a three-dimensional diagram. So as we look along from left to right, we're looking at countries ranked from the poorest up to the richest. But as we look down the diagram, we're looking within a country at the inequality within that country. So right at the top here, we've got the richest country in the world in this survey, Norway. This is the income, the average income of the bottom 10% of the population. This is the average income of the top 10% of the population. And what you can see, there's a whole bunch of things you can see in this, and we'll look at this in more detail in lectures, is in the poorer countries, so here's China, here's India, the breadth of the bars shows you how big the country is in terms of population. Even the top 10% of the population in China and India actually is pretty poor compared to even the lower income ends of the income distribution in rich countries. And so one thing we bring out of this, when you start thinking about this, and we'll talk about it in a lot more detail, is that differences between countries are actually a lot more important than differences within countries. However important those differences are, there are big differences within countries, but the biggest differences are those between countries. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the world as a whole is still a pretty poor place. And another thing that core allows us to do, the core material allows us to do, is to point out that actually this is really not something that has just started recently, the poverty that we see in the world. In fact, not very long ago, basically everyone was poor. And another thing that we can do looking at the data is look at the data over a long span of history. So this is going back more than 1,000 years. And what this brings out, this is 5 countries looking at their GDP per head, a crude measure of living standards. And basically what it tells you is for hundreds of years, everyone in the world was pretty much equally poor and miserable. And only really in the last couple of hundred years have we seen this extraordinary emergence from poverty in some countries. So we've got Britain taking the lead there in the 19th century, and then other countries catching up. And then in the more recent past, you can see China soaring ahead, still well behind in terms of income per capita compared to the rich countries, and then even India beginning to pick up, but still got a long way to go. And we'll spend a lot of time thinking about this issue. And we'll be thinking about what is the nature of this economic system that has produced this extraordinary transformation. And we'll think about this issue using data. We'll also think about it using the tools that economists use to analyse the world. And a key element of that is modelling tools like diagrams. Here we've got the classic diagram in economics of a production function linking inputs in terms of labour to output. We'll spend a lot of time. It's amazing how much you can do with a simple diagram like this that allows you to think about developments in modern economies. And as we progress, to begin with, we'll just be using diagrams, but as we progress, we'll start to use some basic mathematical tools to analyse those diagrams and maximise what we can get out of them. But as the course proceeds, that maths begins to get a little bit tougher, and we start to introduce calculus in order to allow us to think in more detail about some of these mathematical properties that allow us to analyse the world. Now, don't be alarmed by the maths. one key element of the BSc Economics Plus programs at Birkbeck is we do not make any assumption about your initial maths ability. There's one stream of students every year who come in without any prior training of maths beyond GCSE, and we teach you carefully, and we've seen year after year that these students can do extraordinarily well by getting to grips with the maths, and we help you along with that. And just to give you an idea of that, I'll now hand over to one of my colleagues, Susie Newhan, who teaches the maths to this introductory group of students.
Hello, I'm Susie Newhan. I'm one of the lecturers on the first year of the Economics undergraduate programme. I particularly lecture a module in maths, and this is the module aimed at students who have not had the opportunity to study A-level maths before. So I do a revision of some of the really essential GCSE maths, and then take it forward into the kind of tools you will need on your other modules within economics.
So let's have a quick look at one of the models you just saw. Amongst the economists, the much loved production function. Output, amount of output you get from any level of input. I think on the previous slide it was amount of grain produced by a certain number of farmers. So for people who come to Birkbeck with very little maths background, my role will be to start getting you used to functions like this. When we say that output is a function of labour input, it depends on how much input, and we get used to thinking of this as a sort of an infinite number of points, but plotting the relationship between input and output. And we would learn how to read a graph like this if this was 50 units of labour, 50 people or whatever. We learn that how to read this as a certain amount of output, thousands of grains, thousands of tons of grain or whatever. We might also start looking at the shape of this function, and we see this as what we consider a sort of classic diminishing returns shape, because what it's telling us is that early on, when we have very few units of labour, every time we add another one, we get a big increase in the amount of output. Yep, so we get a lot of bangs for our bucks to begin with. But as we keep adding more labour, the amount of extra output we get from each new person is really sort of tapering off. It gets less and less efficient to add more because they're competing for the same resources, etc., etc. So to begin with, we can do quite a bit of analysis, average output at different levels, just using the maths you already know. But at some point, we have to get much more sophisticated. And we start modelling it with some algebra. So we might have something like amount of grain is a function of some number 80, say, and farmers. So in algebra, we link grain with the number of farmers. And once we've got it into algebra, we can do all sorts of stuff with it. We can do the glorious differential calculus, which those of you who haven't done A-level will not have encountered yet. And once we can do that, we can do all sorts of things. And we can use such analysis to help firms maximise output, minimise costs, governments to alter their policy. We can do all sorts of optimisations. And quite frankly, once you've got some maths behind you, the sky is the limit.
Now, we're very conscious that studying economics is a big change in your lives. You have to absorb a tremendous amount, both the maths, the new concepts in economics, but also we give you a lot of training in the IT that goes along with economics, statistical packages and so forth. And so there's a lot to take in. And so one really crucial element of year one is keeping up with the material. And we motivate you in this by making sure that all the modules that you're completing have a strong element of coursework. In Introduction to Economics, for example, we have our Moodle environment for students, which you have to keep on top of, even in an online world, but this was true even before the online world. There are lots of online resources that are crucial to the learning experience, whether you're coming to lectures or not. And so you'll be very frequently going into the Moodle environment, and one key element in several of the modules is every week you'll have a weekly quiz, and these quizzes earn you marks. In total, the coursework that you do in two of your key modules in year one adds up to 50% of your marks. So each week you're earning marks from taking a quiz. And you'll take these online. These are already set up, and we'll be using this very similar material to what we've used in previous years. Multiple choice questions, but using sophisticated tools in economics. So you can't just guess these questions, you have to think hard about them. Those feed into your marks. Another key element is every week in Introduction to Economics you have a class group with a small group of students and a tutorial teacher, and you go through material that gives you practice in applying the concepts that you've been learning. So here, for example, was right towards the end of the course when we were studying macroeconomics, Keynesian macroeconomics. We were looking in classes at applying these tools, but applying them in the context of the COVID crisis, thinking about how the COVID crisis was going to hit the macroeconomy in this Keynesian framework. Another really crucial element, as well as the weekly quizzes, it's no good just responding to multiple choice questions. You've also got to learn to actually do constructive work in economics, which means you actually have to submit assignments. So through the course of the year, you'll have to submit 4 assignments. You submit them electronically. We make sure that you actually submit them by phone. We don't rely, and this is crucial, on people having computers. You can get by through year 1, even on a phone. You scan in your work via phone, you submit them, and you get your feedback back from your class teacher. And those also add crucially to your marks in year 1. But more to the point, they really, really reinforce the concepts that you're learning in economics. And here's just an example of the kind of question that you'd be asked in one of your assignments, sometimes numerical questions. So looking at balance sheets here, but thinking about how that relates to the macroeconomy through money. Just to conclude this short session on Economics Plus at Birkbeck, we're very well aware that these are very uncertain times, but COVID and the crisis resulting from it should not stop you starting your degree in economics and related disciplines at Birkbeck. We are ready to teach online. We have a lot of experience of teaching online already. Even before the crisis, during the crisis, we've already got a lot of expertise in teaching online in a flexible way. And remember, of course, our teaching is built around evening teaching, which means if you're worried about your job situation at the moment and you think you might get a job but you're not sure, the great thing about working at Birkbeck is you can consider taking job offers even while you're still studying at the same time. Another key point that we want to stress is that this is not just disembodied voices over PowerPoint slides. You'll see actual human beings. You will interact with those human beings. We'll interact with you because we'll be seeing your faces on screen as well. We hope that as the year progresses, once social distancing regulations allow it, that you'll be able to come back to Birkbeck if you're able to. But if you're not able to come back because you're stuck outside London, you haven't been able to get accommodation, you will still be able to have online teaching with interaction all the way through the academic year. So if you want more information, go to our website here, click on Study Here, and you'll get lots of information. You can even watch this video again if you want to. But I do hope to see you in the autumn.